Does English come from Latin? Does English come from German? Matter of fact, does English come from anything? How are different languages related? In just a moment, we're going to show you how linguists can go back through time and space and show how languages are related and how they go about finding the lost ancestors of the languages we speak today. In our last program, we were talking about grammar. We were talking about syntax, about how sentences, particularly in English, patterned, and how we could go about finding out from actual sounds how the whole of grammar could be really set up on the basis of sounds. This particular kind of linguistic work is called descriptive linguistics because we're describing the structure of a language as it's spoken at one instant in time, in this case, the present. What we're going to do today is to talk about historical linguistics. We're going to go back in time and space. Actually, we're going to do some detective work. And we're going to find how various kinds of clues that we can see in languages actually will allow us to reconstruct languages that nobody's ever heard or ever seen, languages for which we have no texts whatsoever, and yet through systematic correspondence to get a very good idea of what languages were like thousands of years ago. Now, this whole business of historical linguistics and how languages are related, it attracted people's attention, particularly at the end of the 18th century and all through the 19th century, when so much of the beginnings of scientific work were really being laid. The method was called the comparative method, because scholars found that languages actually were similar. That is, there were languages that were spoken very close to each other in Europe that had words that sounded quite alike, looked quite alike, and meant the same things. Now, in looking at words and words only, we know we're in pretty dangerous territory, and particularly if you look at texts only, that is, at words written down, you're obviously missing all of those clues, those cues that come from intonation, from stress, the things that we've been bringing out on this program. But still, you can do a lot of very important work just working with words. And this is all that those scholars in those days really had to work with, because our particular way of approaching language had not yet been worked out. But they found that there were patterned correspondences and that they could compare them. In other words, I'll show you how this works. Actually, what they did when they were trying to find out how languages were related, what they did was to say, well, if we go and work with the words that are the words of the most stable part of the vocabulary, the words that are for the common parts of the body, for instance, words that have to do with relationships, the common relationships like mother and father, words that have to do, for instance, with numerals, things that are really blood and bone parts of the vocabulary of the language. This stable part might give us some kinds of clues to begin with, to see about how vocabularies are related and how languages are related. For instance, here on our board, we have 4 very familiar English words, tooth, hand, mother, and father. Now, in Dutch, they look quite alike and they sound quite alike, Tand, Han, Mutter, Vater. In German, San, Hand, actually this is written, of course, a D in the writing system, but it really is, it stands for a T sound, San, Hand, Mutter, Vater. And in Danish, Tand, Han, Mutter, and Vater. In other words, these words sound very much alike, they look very much alike, and they mean the same thing. In other words, these particular languages are definitely related. But how? Did one of these languages come first and the others sort of come from it, to descend from it? In other words, how are these languages related? This was the problem the scholars in those days were interested in. Which was oldest? Were they all the same age? How to answer this question really concerned them. Now, actually, in the Romance languages, if we examine these same kinds of words, we will find the same kinds of correspondences. French, don, main, mère, père, for the same words, tooth, hand, mother, father. Spanish, diente, mano, madre, and padre. Latin, dente, mano, Italian, dente, and so on and so on. Portuguese, mão, mãe, and so on. Again, these kinds of words look very much alike, and they sound very much alike. Now, here is the thing that we knew. Scholars knew that all of the Romance languages came from Latin. In other words, it was known historically that it was Latin that was the parent of all of these languages. Now, here are the words in Latin. Danes, dentis, for tooth, the nominative and the genitive. Manus for hand, mater, and pater. In other words, we knew the relationship right away of these languages. Here was the parent, and these were the children, if you will. These were brothers and sisters, and this was the parent. Now, the problem was, how were we going to get a parent if that was the situation for the Germanic languages? We had no texts like the Latin text to go to. Remember, Latin was spoken way back BC, and we have text records for a long, long time, and we know exactly how the Romance languages originated. But how are we going to get the same kind of situation in Germanic? Well, one of the things that scholars knew they'd have to do was to go back to the oldest texts they possibly could. And they would have to take these particular words and compare them. So they went back to the oldest text in English, where these words were tof, hand or hand, moeder, and vader. Old Dutch, the oldest form. These date from around, let's say 6th or 7th century A.D. Old High German, tand, hand, mortar, and vater. Old Norse from around 900. Again, these particular words can be seen to be in about the same kind of relationship as the modern languages were. In other words, they seem to be brother and sister type relationships. And if they are brother and sister type relationships, again, how are we going to try to reconstruct or find out, if we could, the parent from which they all came? Well, luckily, scholars had a very old Germanic language, Gothic. Now, the Gothic text that we have dates from about, it's in the 400s. It comes from a translation of the Bible by a Gothic monk named Ulfilas, who was actually a bishop, as a matter of fact, and who translated the Bible. So we have a very old form, at least older than any of these others. And here we find the word for tooth was tunthus. This particular symbol here stands for a thus sound. The word for hand was handus, with endings on them that had disappeared in all of the other languages. There is no word that I have for mother in this from this particular material that I was working with, which is why there's a blank here. Of course, there was a Gothic word for mother, but it was not related to these others, came from another source. Word for father, father. Now, here again is our problem. Was Gothic the parent of these other languages? Was it the parent? No. Because it was so closely related in time and space, it was decided that Gothic was only an older brother. And it consequently gave us very good material to reconstruct now a language which we can call Proto-Germanic, which would date from about 1 A.D. And here is how it was reconstructed, systematically, through correspondences. In other words, the word for tooth must have been something like tanth. It had an ending on it. Because we don't know exactly what the ending was, we leave a little dash there. Handus is pretty close to the form it must have been. We will put the ending right on there. And moder was the word. It must have sounded quite like that. Not exactly, of course, but quite like that, moder and father. This particular reconstruction, these particular reconstructions, and please notice that little asterisk means they have never been found in any text. We are reconstructing systematically from the material we have here formulas, if you will, that will account for all of the languages that have descended from this particular period. Now, having done this, actually what we have done, if you will, is to place now a reconstructed Proto-Germanic, which in time will now compare with Latin and Greek around 1 A.D. Incidentally, I'd like to show you a page of the Gothic Bible. It's one of the most beautiful manuscripts in the world. It's called the Codex Argentius. It's done on purple vellum with silver letters. And here is that part from the beginning of the parable on the prodigal son. Mane sums aita twan sunnuns, says the Gothic. A certain man had 2 sons. This is the way it starts. Looking at these letters, you will see that some of them look quite like Latin letters, and some of them, like this one, for instance, are obviously from the Greek alphabet. In other words, this particular alphabet that Ulfilas used is from both the Latin and the Greek alphabet. And I think you'll agree that this is a very nice-looking page. However, to get back to our problem, Gothic was then seen to be seemed to be an older brother, and what we now had to do was to take our reconstructed Proto-Germanic with the help of Gothic, and now compare that reconstructed Proto-Germanic with the actual text we had of Latin and Greek, all at about the same time. Now, to help in this particular problem, just as Gothic helped out in the problem of reconstructed Proto-Germanic, there was a very, very old language that was found in India called Sanskrit. And it was discovered, at least as far as the West was concerned, when the English went into the subcontinent of India. And because Sanskrit, which was actually preserved in texts carefully, as it had been spoken 1,000 years before Christ, it was believed that Sanskrit, because of its extreme age, might have been the parent of all of the other languages that we were concerned about. But then it was found that was not the situation. And in fact, the man who really first made the statement, that is the statement that we now follow today, was a man named Sir William Jones, one of the British who was out there in India, who in 1786 made the following and wrote the following observation. Sanskrit, in relation to Greek and Latin, bears a stronger affinity both in the roots of verbs and in the forms of grammar than could possibly have been produced by accident. So strong, indeed, that no philologer, that's what they called a linguist at that time, could examine them all three without believing them to have sprung from some common source, which perhaps no longer exists. There is a similar reason, though not quite so forcible, for supposing that both the Gothic and the Celtic, though blended with a very different idiom, had the same origin with the Sanskrit. In other words, Sanskrit appears now not the daddy, but the older brother. And scholars followed this particular suggestion, and then they knew what they had to do was to put Sanskrit with all of the other languages and compare them. And here is again how they did it, systematically. Here are our words tooth, mother, and father again, and we've added to this one the word ten. Again, numerals are very good for this kind of purpose. Latin, Danes, dentis, nominative, and the genitive. Now notice the Greek. Here is the Greek form for the genitive. The nominative is hodus, but hodontas. Notice the O in the stem as against the E. Sanskrit dan danta. And what scholars then did was, on the basis of the E and the O, reconstruct for the parent language, now called reconstructed Proto-Indo-European, going back in time to about 2500 BC. Forms of dont-dent, dialect forms which may well have been different in different dialects with an O in the stem or an E in the stem. Take this word for father, for instance. This is a rather interesting one. Latin shows pater with a long mark here, which is actually a long vowel here. It doesn't show here in the slide. Pater, the Greek. Now notice the Sanskrit, pater. Pater with an accent here. This is very important. The accent is here, and the vowel is represented in the Sanskrit text by an I vowel. Whenever this particular vowel appeared in Sanskrit and an A in Latin and Greek, reconstruction had it that this was a sort of weak vowel because the accent was over here, and it must have been something like pter, pter. This was the way the word would possibly have sounded. Obviously, what I'm doing here is only showing you a formula that systematically will account for all the other forms, the actual forms that we have. Same thing for the word for 10. In other words, what scholars were able to do, working systematically now, through systematic correspondences of phonemes, that's actually what this was, to set up phonemic formulas, if you will, that would tell you about the structure of a language that was spoken 2,500 years before Christ. Now the problem was, of course, this. How were the Germanic languages now that we saw first? Those are the ones we're particularly interested in because English is a Germanic language. How were the Germanic languages to be brought in to line now with this Proto-Indo-European, with this Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit? Remember, we've already reconstructed a Proto-Germanic, and that's going to be our starting point. So what scholars did was to find the following. In fact, two of the most important people on this, or at least the people who are most important in this whole thing. One was a young Dane named Rasmus Rask, who found out that there seemed to be a systematic, again, correspondence between certain consonants in the Germanic languages and in Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. But the people who actually, the two men who actually presented this most completely systematically to the world, at least so their name came connected with it, were the famous Grimm brothers of fairy story fame. Their actual fame really rests to us scholars on the work they did in linguistics, although we all read Grimm's fairy tales too when we were kids. Here is what Rask and the Grimm brothers found. They found that when we had a P sound, a T sound, a K sound in Proto-Indo-European, that these particular reconstructed sounds remained unchanged in all of the languages except for Germanic. I've used Latin as an example of all other languages of the family except Germanic. Notice, pater, trace, and cornu. Word for father, word for three, and word for horn. T sound here, k sound here, PTK. Now, in Germanic, these systematically are represented by F, TH, and H. And father, three, and horn. All the Germanic languages show F, TH, and H. Now, they also found that the sounds B, D, and G, as reconstructed, represented in the formula B, D, and G, as shown in Latin, duo, for the word for two, granum, the word for corn or grain, and here the B represented in the Greek word cannabis, meaning hemp, that these sounds, these B's, D's, and G's, systematically became, or are represented, or correspond in Germanic with P, T, and K. Hemp, a P, T, a two, and K for the word for corn. Then we found, or they found, that the particular sounds that are reconstructed as BH, DH, and GH, and we don't know how these were pronounced, if you will, or what actual sounds these writings represent, that these particular things here now change systematically in all the languages. Sanskrit shows BH, DH, and GH. Baharami, word meaning I carry, adhat, he did, karta, the word for garden. Actually doesn't exist in Sanskrit. We've reconstructed it here and put a star on it. Greek, phi, theta, and chi. Pharaoh, peso, hortas. The same three words. Notice PH, TH, and KH. Latin, F, F, and H. Pharaoh, feci, hortus. Now these became simple B, D, G in Germanic. B, D, and G. Bear, did, and garden. In other words, here was a very important series of correspondences. Absolutely regular, except for a few exceptions. And when exceptions occur in any scientific statement, the scientist immediately says, all right, let's find if there's some special cases that I haven't covered in my statement. And the man who worked on the special cases that didn't seem to work quite so well was a famous Norwegian scholar named Carl Werner. And Werner said, there are only certain of these particular cases that don't seem to work. And one of them was in this very important word for father. It's a very good example of where Grimm's law, as it's called, doesn't seem to operate. In other words, that T ought to become a TH sound in the Germanic languages. But Gothic shows a D, and Old English shows a D, fader. What happened? Well, what Werner found out was this. He went back again to the Sanskrit and reminded himself that that accent on that particular part of the word showed that the accent, again in Proto-Indo-European, was here. By the same token, this word for garden, gaharta, which we just saw, had the accent there. Reconstructed in Proto-Indo-European is hortas, with an accent over there. Please notice now over here, in our Latin and Greek, we have not too much evidence to show us about where the accent was, but that Sanskrit tells us. And here's what Werner said then. Whenever the accent was one syllable past this particular vowel, the first vowel, the T went on and became a D regularly. So, fader, and the Old English word for yard, yard, modern English, yard, modern English garden, which came in from the Norman French, from another Germanic language. Modern English father with a the actually is that way through analogy with mother. In other words, what Werner found then was this, that even where there seemed to be exceptions, there weren't any exceptions. If we only saw the special case of accent in every single case, we would then find that a separate kind of change, an additional change, operated. It was this particular discovery which showed that there could be complete predictability, which was the greatest advance of social science in the 19th century. This was the first time that human behavior actually has been put on a scientific basis. This is human behavior. These particular things that we're dealing with are pieces of human behavior, and we find that they are predictable and patterned. It was Werner's law added to Grimm's law that gave linguistics its real scientific footing. Now, we have pushed a language back in time. Now, where were the people that spoke this language? Where were they? Well, I can say one thing about it. People have been concerned about where our linguistic ancestors were for a long, long time. It's fascinating. Here's how scholars decided to work on the problem. They said we've got common vocabulary terms which we can find in all of these languages. We find, for instance, that all of the languages show us, and we can consequently put into the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European vocabulary, words that show they must have had a pretty rough climate. Words for snow and ice and rain and for heat of summer. That they were inland because there's no word in any of their vocabularies, and we can't reconstruct a common word for a big body of water like the ocean. We find that, again, there are no words for tropical animals like crocodile or elephant, but there are words for bear, wolf, otter. So, scholars said they must have been inside somewhere, and they've got to be placed somewhere where we could put them all back again. For instance, here is what they did. They said, we know that we find these languages all over Europe and parts of Asia. If we put them all back together again, because we know they have migrated from a common source, gather them all back together again, they fit just about here. And probably the most important evidence they had for placing the linguistic homeland of the Indo-European speaking peoples here was the fact that they all have a common word for beech tree. In other words, the beech tree is almost the most important clue to where we're placing them. And we know from evidence that the beech tree at this point did not go any farther than this part of Europe at 2500 BC. So therefore we know that about here must have been where our linguistic ancestors were, if we gather them all back. Now, not only do we know this, we can tell pretty well. You see, here were the Germanic peoples where we find them in history. Pull them back and they come back here. The Balto-Slavic, pull them back, they come back here. The Indo-Iranians, pull them back, they come back here. In other words, what we find now is pretty much the dialect division of the original homeland. Germanic here, Italo-Celtic here. This is where the Latin and Celtic languages came from. Hellenic for Greek. And down here in the middle was a dialect boundary called the Kentum-Sotum line. That means that all the languages to the west had a word for hundred that began with a ha sound, as in English hundred. But all the languages that were to the east had a word for hundred that began with a s sound, like Sanskrit shatam. So we even can tell something about the dialect divisions of the original homeland. I don't want you to take this too literally, but it gives you a very good idea of what you can do working systematically. So at 2500 BC then, our linguistic ancestors, the Indo-Europeans, the Proto-Indo-Europeans, were about here. Now, at what time and how did they migrate? Well, this is another problem. I'd like to show you now how we get at this problem. Probably one of the most important things that we have in settling this particular problem is another important discovery. The discovery of a language called Hittite, which was written on cuneiform clay tablets in cuneiform writing. That dates now from about 1700 BC, the earliest of these tablets. Remember, Sanskrit only went back to 1000 BC. Here now we have a language related to these languages we've been talking about that actually goes back, texts that go back to 1700 BC. Now, putting Hittite back into comparison with Proto-Indo-European allows us to reconstruct a Proto-Indo-Hittite, and that goes back roughly 1,000 years farther. In other words, we now are able to say something about the parent language back as far as 3500 BC. Unless we find some other wonderful remains like the whole library at Bogazkoy of the Hittite Empire, I don't think we're going to get very much farther back than this. Now, what happened was this. It seems that our friends, the Hittites, and other speakers of languages that we call Anatolian, and they went down into Asia Minor, left somewhere between 3500 and 2500 BC, leaving behind our friends, the Indo-Europeans, in full possession of this territory, as we've just seen on the map at 2500 BC. Then, throughout this period, the various branches left one by one. Armenian first, then the Indo-Iranian speakers, the ones of Sanskrit and Old Persian, left at about, well, between 2300 and 2200 BC, leaving behind those people who were left. In other words, the ones that were everybody but the Indo-Iranian. Then the Hellenic speakers, the people that are to be the forerunners of the Greeks, left at about 2000. Then South and West European speakers left, the Italic and the Celtic, from 1800 to 1500. Here we get those particular people that we're most interested in, the Germanic speakers. Here is our family, and they seem to have left the original homeland between 800 and 500 BC, leaving behind only the Balto-Slavic. And the Balto-Slavic was split, and the Baltic speakers went in about 1 AD into the area now surrounding the Baltic, around Lithuania, leaving behind only the Slavic speakers. And if you will notice, the Slavic speakers are still right smack in that homeland, and they haven't yet moved. Well, all of the other Indo-European speaking peoples, when they moved, as we know, they caused a great deal of furor. We can remember in history what happened to the Goths and the Vandals and the Burgundians and the Norsemen. And our own English speakers have caused quite a lot of, shall I say, world ferment as they have spread all over the face of the earth. Well, now perhaps we are going to see for the next 50 or 100 years the completion of the Slavic expansion. I don't know. I leave that for you to contemplate. Anyhow, it's interesting to see how we can actually see these particular groups moving away one by one and leaving behind parent languages that can be reconstructed for all of the others. And we'll be saying more about our Germanic languages in our next program. Now, to summarize what we have been talking about today, actually, we have been following linguistic clues. And we have worked carefully in terms of correspondences and have been able actually to reconstruct linguistic forms, actually formulas, if you will, but linguistic forms, which can account for all of the actual languages, the words in actual languages that we have, even from the oldest text down. And in this reconstruction, we've actually been able to get back to 3500 BC. Back in time, back in space. And this, again, is systematic and patterned. Now, in our next program, what we're going to do is to follow the English language. We're going to zero in, so to speak, on our own linguistic ancestors and find out how these people started from scratch and spread their language all over the face of the earth. We're going to find out where they came from, how they got to England, something about what happened to them there. And we're going to do this by one of the most important, again, ways we have of watching how languages develop, namely through their vocabulary. We're going to find out how the English vocabulary changed, how it grew and how it added as the speakers of English went all over the face of the earth, how they borrowed words from other languages, how our own present vocabulary came to be what it is. We're going to see other world languages at the same time, other languages that have spread, important languages. We're also going to find out about other languages of the world that aren't world languages, to see how many they are, what they're like. And we're going to also concern ourselves with the whole matter of an artificial language. Should there be only one language? The whole matter of make up a language or take a real language that's around, and can that be a language for all mankind to speak? Be with us then, won't you?
This is National Educational Television.